Yeah, so I think we'll just get started, and if someone else will join, we'll see. Welcome to my session about developing secure Joomla extensions. I'm David. I'm from Cologne in Germany. Lovely city, and also the city where JInput, the other international Joomla conference, will take place next year in May. Feel free to join me. You'll see those lovely little boats on the Rhine River in front of the picture. We'll have one of those for our Joomla boat tour during JInput. Don't miss it. More information, go find me and I'll tell you. I'm part of the Joomla community since I think next year it's actually the better half of my life. I started with Membo back in 2004. I'm 27, almost 28 now, so we're getting close where I can say this lovely sentence. I'm running a small agency in Cologne, mostly doing Joomla-related development, and I have a gazillion different jobs in the projects. Some of them are still active, some of them are more former positions. I'm running the German Joomla Day, I'm running the JInput conference, I'm a former member of the community leadership team, and now I have only one job, at least in the international project, which is leading the Joomla security team. For me personally, it's actually kind of a fun job. Cleaning up other people's mess is something that I really enjoy. And whenever you see me opening up my laptop, reading an email, getting nervous and running away, you should too. Because I'll know first when things go wrong. And that's kind of the nasty side of having this job. You always hear things from me when things already got wrong. So I'll have always negative attention, but at least attention, which is also not that bad. Mostly you'll see me arrive on the horizon when your site looks like this. That's the typical scenario when your site has been hacked and defaced. In this case, by some script kiddie, probably. You also see other sorts of hacks where you as the site owner will probably notice absolutely nothing from the successful hack, and it's more likely that your hosting company will contact you someday that you're sending spam, or that just the police knocks on your door because you're hosting some child pornography or those kind of things without knowing. All of this happened in the real world. Those hacked sites are a problem for you or your client, but they are also a huge problem for the global industry when it comes to web security, because once your site is hacked, you'll start sending spam. Spam is a big thing in the internet still nowadays. It's get filtered, but it's still there. Your site does DDoS stuff against other sites, taking down Facebook or WhatsApp, and that's really a huge pain for me. You'll host a phishing site and someone's bank account gets emptied, and all of those things happen using hacked sites. And it's important to realize that this is a global problem that needs a global solution. One of the more interesting parts of my job is that I'm only responsible for Joomla core. So I'm not securing Joomla extensions, and that's probably better, because if I look at the vulnerable extension list, that's val.joomla.org if you want to look it up, I'm freaking out. I did a quick count on the number of extensions that had a known vulnerability this year so far, and it's 110. And that's the tip of the iceberg. Most security researchers, most bad guys look for vulnerabilities in the core software or in the really popular extensions. If it's just Twitter module XYZ, there's rarely anybody taking notice of security issues. So 110, I would assume that it's at least 5 to 10 times more in reality when it comes to vulnerable extensions. And the sad part is that those vulnerabilities that are most common in those extensions are vulnerabilities that you'll find on the OWASP top 10 list. OWASP is a sort of cooperation association between different security researchers, developers, and they kind of formed a group to exchange best practices in securing web applications. And each and every year they publish a list of the most common vulnerabilities, the most common things that people do wrong. And in order to make you develop secure extensions, I'm going to show you the most prominent ones, the most important ones for the Joomla extension world, and that's what's going to happen in the next few minutes. The one that's causing me the most headache, because it's the major thing in extension development, is SQL injection. Imagine the following code snippet. We're collecting a title and an alias from the content table, and we do so by filtering for a specific ID. And the ID comes from $_get ID. So that's a user-supplied argument. If you're in development, you should start to scream now, run away, pull out your hairs, because that's an SQL injection. Why? As long as my ID parameter in the URL is just 12, 1, 11, I'm all good. But if it's 12 union select username password from users, I have a problem. Because I'm not doing any validation, any filtering, no nothing. I'll just take the plain input from the user, pass it to the query, and the resulting query looks like this. Give me the title and the alias of content with the ID 12, and give me usernames and passwords of all users from the users table. The end thing, that's union select. Union select means do another query that needs to return the exact same amount of columns than my original query, and then both get combined. And if you would have such an extension on your side and call it, you'll see the title and the alias of the article and the username and the password hash of the administrator and all other users. That's kind of bad. We're using some pretty good password hashing algorithm nowadays in Joomla, so it's rather unlikely that one is able to return the hash into a plain text string. But for example, if an administrator is logged in while I'm doing the query, I can also query the session table. I get a session ID. I can use it to log in as the currently logged in administrator, and then I create my own account and I'll do all those fancy things that I do as a script kiddie. That's one scenario. No validation at all. Easy to fix in this case by casting the ID, which is an integer, to int. If it's a string, it just becomes 0. The query returns nothing useful, but it's not an SQL injection anymore. Same applies to floats. Just do some proper typecasting in this case, and it's fixed. It's a bit harder if we're actually looking for strings. In this case, you need to quote them and escape, both in theory. Joomla and the JDatabase driver, they have a method called quote, which automatically also escapes the string that you pass. So two things happening simultaneously. That's also the reason, and I see this quite often, why you don't need to call db quote, db escape wrapped. It's just quote and you're fine. There's a second parameter for the method, which is a Boolean true or false, and this is true by default, which means also do the escaping. Do this and you're fine. If you're using column names, like in this case alias, and that's user supplied input, because for example you're ordering for a specific column, then you have a column name, use quote name, which does exactly the same. That's not rocket science, but it solves the issue of SQL injections completely. Why do we still have it? Because one needs to remember it. Even good developers tend to forget stuff from time to time, including myself. Yes, I have SQL injections too in my code. I saw them. And so we discussed how to solve this on a long-term perspective. And during the production department meeting, we considered switching to prepared statements with Joomla 4, or at least offering support for prepared statements. Prepared statements very simple strategy. That's an example with just plain PHP PDO. You'll separate the actual query and the used values from each other. So in this case, you have the column name, column value in the query, and you'll pass the actual values for those in separate calls. And this kind of guarantees that it runs through all those escaping quote thing, and you don't screw up anymore. Very simple fix for the problem. Not really a simple implementation on our side because Joomla is supporting different database drivers. They are different when it comes to prepared statements, so we'll most likely need some sort of intermediate layer in between to translate those, but we'll figure out. There's going to be a prepared statement sprint that I'll organize, and then we'll have a look. SQL injection, that's one type of injection that we see quite often, but there are also others. LDAP injection is the thing that has been fixed with Joomla 3.8 and 3.8.2. LDAP is a protocol used for authentication, and it works also with the query language. And what we did before 3.8 was just taking the username that the user inserted in the username field and passed it along to the LDAP server without any escaping, once again. And that's LDAP injection. The other thing that might affect you if you're, for example, calling some shell commands, or if you're doing something with image magic, which is also called via exec, shell exec, and all those things, is command injection. If you're using a user-supplied input like a file name to process, you need to make sure that this file name is escaped to be used on command line. Otherwise, you can use the file name to kind of cut off the first command and add another one that does bad things. That's the underlying issue in the PHP mailer thing that has been fixed quite a while ago. That's also command injection using sendmail. Check your code. The other thing is cross-site scripting. That's the second most popular vulnerability that I see when it comes to extensions. You'll see the abbreviation XSS, but it's the same thing. Imagine the following code. We do a search, not related to Joomla, just doing a search. We're getting the search word, once again, from the user, no validation, no escaping, no nothing. We're outputting it, and we're passing it along to our database to do the actual search, and there it's escaped there probably, so no SQL injection. As long as I use a search word like foobar, it's all good. It gets appended in the HTML code, it gets displayed, all fine. But what happens if my search word is script with so script tag with some fancy JavaScript in it, in this case just an alert one, then I have a problem. Because this user-supplied input, the HTML, gets outputted without anything, and I'll end up with a script tag in my markup. Cross-site scripting is the type of vulnerability where quite often the developer's reaction is, yeah, okay, happens, not that important, who would click on such a link anyway? I kind of get the idea. But there are two problems. The one thing is people are stupid, so they click on those links. And if it's the administrator clicking on that link and you're able to execute some JavaScript, you can consider the site hacked. Because the administrator is logged in, the JavaScript can behave as the user's browser, for example, create a new user for the attacker and post it to an API that the attacker runs in order to take over the site. So a simple cross-site scripting can lead to a full exploit on the site with all privileges. And the other thing is stored cross-site scripting. A popular example is the WordPress XSS in the comments feature. It could be used by an attacker to have some bogus comment entered in the site. He submits it. The administrator takes a look in order to review this comment that was stored in the database. And the moment the administrator looks at it to review it, the code gets executed, and there it is, full-scale privilege escalation. So this is not a minor issue. That's important to realize, not a low priority thing. What I often see in Joomla is people are using JInput. That's what they're supposed to do. For example, with the string filter, that's the line on top, get the search word using the string filter. The string filter runs within JInput through a filter that filters bad markup. Things like script tags, things like the on-click attributes, all the things that can actually trigger JavaScript by default. What it doesn't filter is good markup. So you can still add any normal HTML markup in there, add another image tag that shows some weird smiling faces on a corporate website, all those things that really happened in the past. I know some popular examples from politics websites with cross-site scripting things where manipulated links had been submitted to add some content to the site that didn't make any sense for this politician. So this actually happens. And the second thing with the string filter is it doesn't work properly if you're using the output within an attribute. For example, if you're having a data attribute and you want to output user supplied input, string filter is not enough because it's not been built for this specific scenario. If you want to do this stuff, you need to escape it. And as long as you're in a Joomla view template, just call this escape and the input, and you're good to go. At least for normal markup. For attributes, it's a bit more complicated. It depends on your specific use case. So pay specific attentions if you're outputting user input in an attribute. Weird things happen in there. We were also discussing a long-term solution for cross-site scripting problems because it's the same issue. As a developer, I need to remember about these things and I forget it. There are two solutions that might help. One is the content security policy, CSP. That's a technology available in all major browsers. And the basic idea is that you're telling the browser which scripts, assets, fonts, iframes, whatever, are allowed on this specific page. And you're telling it server-side. So when the site is delivered, there's a whitelist for scripts and all those things. And if an attacker is able to inject the script somewhere, it's not part of that whitelist and it won't get executed. It's blocked by the browser. So that's actually quite a nice solution. George Wilson did some work on this for Joomla 4, and it's very likely that we'll ship it with Joomla 4 by default. If you as an extension developer don't want to run in issues, you need to use the JDocument APIs for assets, so add script declaration, add style sheet, and those things, because that's the place where we'll generate the whitelist from. If you're just outputting your stuff somewhere in the code, it's not part of the whitelist and it will get blocked. So use the API, what you're supposed to do anyway. The other thing is we could switch to a different template engine. Right now we're using plain PHP in our templates, Echo, whatever I want. If we switch to a different template engine like Twig, Plate, Smarty, you name them, they are built in a way that output by default is escaped. And if I want unescaped output, I need to specifically call it in that way, and that should make me think if this is required at this specific location. So it turns around the responsibility. I don't need to think anymore to make something secure. That most likely will not make it into Joomla 4 by default because it would break the universe. But it's at least an idea, and we're following that path for future versions. When it comes to JInput in general, read this page. if you haven't done before. That's a documentation page about JInput, where all those different filters are documented, because we're not only having CMD and string, those are the normal ones. We have integer, we have filters to filter for file names, for base64 encoded strings. So there are tons of filters in there that will make your life easier if you know them. The other thing that's not so commonly used in the world of exploits, but has some great impact, is insecure deserialization. What a word. Imagine you're developing a shopping cart for Joomla, and because you're smart, you think it's a good idea to store the current content of that user's cart in a cookie. Why not? People tend to do, this really happened. Don't laugh, it happened. I've seen it in the wild. So you have the cart's content in a cookie, base64 encoded as a serialized PHP object. Serialize is a PHP function, and deserialize that turns an object or an array or a string or an int into a string that you can store somewhere, and you can revert that process later on. That's the thing that serialize and unserialize does. So that's our code. That's kind of bad if you think about it, because if the thing that we pass to unserialize comes from a user, it means that the user, the bad guy, can insert whatever objects in there he wants. Okay, he has some objects, what could possibly go wrong? This go wrong. That's an example of vulnerable code in terms of object deserialization. What it does, it has a magic method. Those methods within PHP which are automatically called in a magical way, that's why they are called this way. It has a destruct method. This is automatically called when the PHP process ends. Normally it's used, for example, to disconnect your script from the database automatically. In this case, we're doing something similar. We have this hook thing, which would have our disconnection code, and we just pass it to eval to let it execute. If I'm now a nice attack guy, I would pass the following thing as the serialized object, which is an instance of my example class that we've just seen with PHP info as value for hook. And this will mean that once the page call is over, PHP info will automatically be executed. In terms of PHP info, that's not that bad. In terms of loading a backdoor from a different server, executing it and starting DDoSing the world, that would be bad. And that in some way is the underlying issue that we had with Joomla 365, the session thing that got patched multiple times. That was a deserialization issue in the session handler that it had some connection to PHP and also to Joomla, but that's how it worked. A manipulated object that called code. So lesson learned, if we are just storing stuff, just plain strings, use JSON. It's a key value storage. You can't execute nothing from it. That's the proper way of doing stuff. Don't use serialize. And if you need to use serialize, store it on server side and don't let user provided input ever get into unserialize. It will break. Next thing, one of my favorite English words, cross-site request forgery, CSRF. Imagine your browser, you the administrator of mysite.com, you're browsing through the web, and one of your colleagues sends you a Facebook message saying, hey, there's this, you can win this iPad over here, click on that link, fill out the form and hit submit. And you do so, you browse that site while being logged into your administrator interface. You fill out the form, you click submit, and magically, the guy who just sent you the link has a user account on your website. because the form that you've just filled out was not targeted to actually win something, but the action attributes or the target of the form is your site. The task is create a new user, and the data that's in there is your friend's data. If it's really your friend, then he had some good fun and owes you a beer. The normal thing is that the guy is not your friend and you're screwed. And that's the scenario that we have. That's why it's called Crosssite, from one side to other, request forgery, because we are redirecting the thing somewhere else. We've seen real-world examples of this, not also in the Joomla world, but where it's more popular is with your cable router at home. Because if you those cable routers normally have fixed IP addresses or fixed host names, they often have no proper authentication. So you browse somewhere on the web, you click on a form, submit, and in the background your router gets reconfigured, new DNS servers are set, and the next time you do online banking, you're doing the online banking on an attacker's server because he redirected your DNS service. That's where this is good fun, actually. Very easy fix for this, and you've probably seen this before. In most Joomla forms, you will see a hidden field with some obscure name and a value of 1. That's our CSRF token. It's a random, so to say, string, which is associated to your session. So it's unique per session, per user. Your browser knows because Joomla sends it. Joomla knows because it generates it, but nobody else knows. And that's the key thing. It's impossible for an attacker to guess that token in advance, and that's what he would need to do because Joomla checks if those token matches your user token on each and every form submit. And when you've stumbled upon the invalid token message, and I'm sure you did, this is the place where this is coming from. Most likely because your session expired, or because you're having a caching issue and you've seen someone else's token. This is how it works under the hood. You as a developer just need 2 simple things: add JHTML_form token to your forms and do a JSession check token at the beginning of your controller. Very easy fix, but works perfectly. Another thing to take care of is file uploads. You probably remember in 1.5 times the JCE issue where files got uploaded. That's one of those. Imagine we're uploading a user's file, getting it from user input and storing it on the target path, which is in this case also user supplied, which is the worst case scenario. This is as bad as it can possibly get. We in fact have 2 issues here. We have the unrestricted file upload, so we don't do any validation of the actual file. For example, if this is Media Manager, there are no checks for, is this an image? And if the checks are missing, I could also go ahead and upload a PHP file as my profile picture. This PHP file is a backdoor and you're screwed again. That's the one thing, file validation is missing. And the other thing is that we are not validating the path. In normal scenarios, that would be something like an images folder or the folder name within the media directory. But if this isn't validated, and that's the case in here, I can also use something like dot dot slash and upload the file somewhere else on the server. That also works in the other way around. If I include a file or output a file from somewhere on the file system and don't validate the path, it's also possible to download files from other directories. That's a popular one, and those are called directory traversal attacks, because I can traversal up the tree. 2 things to take care of: validation of file, validation of path. The file thing sounds easy, in the first moment. You just check the extension and then you're good. But in fact, it isn't. We had an issue reported to core a few months ago where it was possible to upload a Flash file, a Flash movie, with the JPEG extension. Normally would think, yeah, shit happens. You have an unusable file on your server. But the thing is that a bunch of browsers don't only look at the file extension, but they also take a look at the MIME type that this file has. And so in those situations, it was possible to have a JPEG named file that was executed as Flash. And that's the reason why checking the file extension is not enough. You also need to validate the file content, the MIME type. And if you want to have a look how this works, JHelper Media can upload is the reference implementation within Joomla core, where you can get some ideas how this actually works. If you're doing media uploads, so images and those kind of things, it's very likely that you can just use this method right away and don't need to reinvent the wheel. When it comes to file names and path names, we have two methods for this. jpath clean makes sure that it's just a single folder, no ... in there. And jfile make safe doesn't strip extensions or those kind of things, but it strips characters that are shouldn't be part of a file name, like HTML characters and those kind of things. Remote file inclusion, that's also great fun. This isn't that much of a problem anymore, and you'll realize in a second why this is. Reason one, you need to be the circumstances need to work. In this case, imagine you're lazy, you are developing a more or less static site, no CMS involved. You're doing this your own because you're smart. You have one static navigation, one static footer, and the actual content in between should be just required from other files because that's the part that changes. And in order to do so, you have this code which takes the file name and includes it. That works fine for start, contact, or about us, but it's not so fine for evil site / backdoor, because in this case, evilsite.com / backdoor.php will be included and executed on your server. That should cause you quite a lot of headache, especially if those two options are enabled on your site. Those are PHP options, and they enable this behavior that a URL can be used within include or require once at all. If those are disabled, this won't work, but you still see them. Mainly because people are saying, curl, that's rocket science for me. I just want to do an fopen with an URL, and those require at least the URL fopen, which has these side effects. You've seen this kind of attacks much more often in early days because there was this, what was it called, register globals. Anyone remembers? The good old back days. In this case, you wouldn't require the first part, the get something from request, because what register globals did was it went through all the global variables, request, get, post, took their contents and turned it into local variables. So in this case, you would automatically have a local $file. And if you're using $file in this local context for something else, you're screwed. This was register globals, and this was the peak time of these sorts of attacks. You don't see them that often anymore today, luckily. Sensitive data exposure. Recently saw an exploit in a download component about this, in a backup component. Remember, we are storing our files of ComSuper backup in the administrator folder, and because we're lazy, we're just adding integers as names, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We could also use timestamps, whatever. And we forgot the one single thing, which is that's a publicly accessible directory on that server. by default, each and every file can be downloaded. You need to specifically exclude it. So if you have something in your web root where you don't want people to be able to fetch it, you need a .htaccess file on Apache or a web.config on IIS with something like deny from all, which blocks access. There's one thing here that it's important to realize. This will work on 99% of the servers, but not on the one single percentage that's either running Nginx or blocking those configuration files. And you'll see them in the wild. They are there. So if you really have something that's private, don't store it in a web root. That's the easy fix. Or at least append something random to the file name so it can't be easily guessed. That's the easy fix. Last but not least, open redirects. You rarely read about those in the real world. Basic idea is the following. We are having a form. We want to redirect people once the form is completed back to this form. So we're having the redirect URL that gets passed as a base64 encoded string. We're decoding it and redirecting the user. That's what this code does. The thing is, if I want to make a Ufuk, for example, get to my evil site and I send him an email, please click here, he takes a look at the URL and he immediately sees, hey, that's kind of bad, I shouldn't click on it. If I have an open redirect, for example, on Joomla.org, Ufuk sees, hey, that's a Joomla.org URL. There's some weird characters at the end, but I don't care. He clicks on it. And because it's an open redirect that can be used for redirects to any other site, he'll get redirected to my target location. So you kind of use the trustworthiness of other people's site in those attacks. We have a very simple fix for this. JURI is internal. Just call it on the path URL, on the user supplied URL, to make sure that the target URL actually belongs to your local Joomla installation. And then you're good. Local redirects are okay. This is pretty much what you can also find on the secure coding guidelines page. This page has its emphasizing on how to filter user input, not so much on escaping and redirect and the other things. I'll probably update it during the next days to make this more comprehensive, but there's the quick summary of most of the things that I just explained. Yeah, last but not least, if you're developing an extension and you either find a security vulnerability by yourself or one is reported to you, don't be an idiot. Don't try to keep this secret. Your users need to update because otherwise they will be still vulnerable. Obvious thing. And if you're making this security relevant fix just a normal patch release, nobody cares. We know this. We know this from the Joomla release cycle. If we mark a release as a security critical one, we see significantly more updates in a short period of time than when it's just a normal patch release. That's normal human behavior. So if you want to keep your client site safe, your user sites, you should explicitly mark it as a security release and be honest about this. People know that things go wrong. There will be the one guy that tells you that you're an idiot and only bad people have security vulnerabilities, but ignore that one guy and do it for the 5,000 others. That's just how it's supposed to be. And report it to the vulnerable extension list, val.joomla.org. Even if it's reported to you, make sure that your extension is listed there too, because lots of people check in there to see if they have a vulnerable version, or if they are, when they are debugging a hack, it's also helpful to go through the list and see, hey, this site has been hacked probably because this component had a known vulnerability. That makes everyone's life easier. Be honest. We'll all have security issues, be transparent with it. Any questions? No? Apparently not. Yes?
You gave the URL right at the beginning of your presentation, and I tried it, but you typed it in wrong.
At the beginning of my presentation.
Retrieving request data.
Oh, yeah. I remember. Give me a second. Where is it? Yeah, there it is. Sorry. Yeah. For the video guys, he asked for the URL about how to retrieve input from users securely. That's it. Yes?
It's not a question. If you would like to just if we find something, a vulnerability, or we heard about something about Joomla, how should we process it and not go public before contacting?
Question is, what is the proper way of reporting security issues? I think both in Joomla core itself, but also in extensions. The proper way is the so-called responsible disclosure. So reporting a vulnerability to the author of that software first, giving the author time to fix it, and once the patch is available, it's okay to also talk about the vulnerability. I personally, I'm not a fan of having in-depth technical analysis about a new vulnerability 5 minutes after the release. One could wait 24 hours, but it's okay. Just do everyone a favor and report it in private. If you're running into a Joomla security issue, feel free to send me an email or use security@joomla.org. That's the main email address, or use the report security issues form that we have on developer.joomla.org. We also have a PGP key published somewhere in here. That's the even better best practice. Always encrypt your findings, at least in Joomla core, because if your finding is real and has a high impact, it has the potential to break people's sites, millions of them, and causing a lot of people a bad day. So we should make sure that this stays private. Same applies for extension developers. Try to contact them first. And in my opinion, it also makes sense to kind of CC the guys from Vel, so they are in the loop too, because this behavior with being transparent with issues and updating in time, that's not so common in the extension developer worlds, unfortunately, so it makes sense to CC them. They can push a bit. You're welcome. Any other questions? Nope? Okay, then go make your stuff secure.